The case against a man accused of the murder of Valhalla Park teen Lekita resumes today. The accused, Cameron Wilson, will appear at the Western Cape High Court.
As we know, the brutal killing of Lekita has been a terrible tragedy, one that has got the entire community asking for justice, pleading for justice, and even the death penalty. Last court case last year, it was discovered that Lekita suffered 97 stab wounds. In addition, it was confirmed that Cameron Wilson was in court for several other murders.
They include murder, rape, and other acts of violence. Wilson was arrested for the murder of teenager Lekita in September last year, while he was out on bail for another murder case.
Cruel and remorseless. Words repeated several times by Judge Chantal Fortuin in handing down sentence. She says the scenes of 20-year-old Wilson's crimes were gruesome, and that he has left permanent emotional scars on his victims and their families. Throughout sentencing, Wilson seemed undeterred.
Welcome to or welcome back to my channel, and thank you very much for joining me here again today. Today we're going to talk about a case that is not only upsetting because of the crimes that were committed, but also how the perpetrator didn't care at all about the crimes that he committed and kind of gave us a sense that this was his proudest moment and that he is incredibly proud of the things that he had done. And the terror that this person left in his wake continues to terrorize the family members, the victims that survived. But with that being said, let's get into today's case.
Intended for mature audiences only.
Today we are heading to an area of Cape Town called the Cape Flats. And the Cape Flats is a hub of culture, art, music, and vibrant people. But the area is home to many suburbs within it. And sadly, with all of its beauty, there was a dark cloud left over by a young teenager. The crimes of this teenager started in October of 2014, where a young man was stabbed in the chest numerous times with a knife. The young man was left for dead in the streets while the assailant ran away. But little did he know that someone is always watching. And this person saw exactly what happened to this young man who was stabbed. And what they did was they knew exactly who was stabbed. They then proceeded to call this person's parents and family, and they were alerted to the horror of their loved one being stabbed and left in the street. Alfonzo van Royen was the victim who was sadly stabbed by the young perpetrator who then ran away. And when Alfonzo's stepfather arrived on the scene, he was still alive at the time and he was then consoled by his loved ones. But sadly, either the witness didn't call an ambulance or the ambulance took a very long time to arrive, which both are plausible. However, when help eventually arrived, it was too late and Alfonzo was declared dead on arrival. And then, the very next day, Alfonzo's stepfather, who was just nonchalantly outside of his house, probably having a lot on his mind, just standing outside, was then approached by a man named Toyah Stober. And Toyah Stober and Alfonzo's stepfather were quite close, they did know each other. And while they are talking, Toyah then notices a young man walking across the street, and Toyah immediately points it out to Alfonzo's stepfather that he heard via the grapevine that that's the man who killed Alfonzo. So Toyah and Alfonzo's stepfather then start talking to the guy, they start shouting at him, swearing at him, and then they proceed to take chase. And the person that they were pointing at, his name is Cameron Wilson. Cameron Wilson was 17 years old at the time, and he was younger, quicker, and more agile than the two older men that were running after him. So he made a quick escape and was able to get out of the clutches of these older men. And the reason that I brought up Toyah and Alfonzo's stepfather's conversation is that 2 days after Cameron noticed that they were talking, sadly, Toyah Schrober's body was found with multiple gunshot wounds and he was found dead. And coincidence? I think not. So like I mentioned earlier, someone is always watching. And the day that Toyah was found dead, his son was actually in the vicinity, not right near him, but close enough to hear an altercation happen. And his son's name was Amin. So Amin hears some altercation happening with his father, Toyah, and he then goes closer to where he's hearing all the noise, and he then sees a young man run away from the scene. And then he sees his dad get into a bakkie and then start driving after this young man. And then a couple minutes go by, and then Amin sadly hears the home phone ringing. His mother then picks up the phone and her demeanor immediately changes. And sadly, she is then made aware that her husband, Toyah, has now been found murdered with at least 5 gunshot wounds to the chest. And he has sadly then crashed his car into a fence. And the young man that Amin saw running away before being then chased by his dad in the bakkie, he identified him as Cameron Wilson. So who is this Cameron Wilson? Well, Cameron grew up in the Cape Flats and he was said to have come from a loving home, as much as it could be. There were reports that Cameron's dad was part of the 28 gang. However, his home was a warm home based on many witnesses. Cameron did not finish school, he didn't take to school very well, and he didn't want to be there. So while Cameron's peers and friends were all at school, he was wandering the streets looking for something to do and trouble to make. But back to the story. So Amin did report to the police that he saw Cameron Wilson running away from the scene before his father then took chase. The police then did go to Cameron's house and they wanted to ask Cameron's mother what was really happening, but they had to tread really lightly because at the time Cameron was still a minor. So police asked Cameron, why were there reports of you at the scene? What were you doing there? And before he could even say anything, Cameron's mother then piped up and she said, oh no, my son was here the whole time. He was busy playing Xbox. He was nowhere near the scene at the time. So police understood that Cameron's mother was obviously trying to defend him, but they really wanted to press Cameron and really ask why so many people saw him at the scene. So Cameron then remembered magically and he was like, oh yeah, I was at the scene. I heard a lot of fighting and shouting happening. So I then heard of all of this. I left my Xbox game and then I went running towards where the drama was happening because I wanted to see what was going on. And that's why Cameron said that he was near the scene at the time. But police didn't really have much to go on with this, so the case kind of went cold for a few weeks because they only really had Amin's testimony and he could only point out Cameron from a distance. And also Toyah, who knew a lot and maybe had this nugget of information, he had now sadly passed away, so he couldn't give any information to the police about Alfonzo von Royen's murder. So this all happened in October of 2014. Now we fast forward a couple months to December of 2014, around Christmas time. And a man named Ernest Erasmus and his girlfriend then went to a pub to join the community in Christmas celebrations. They then were all jolly and warm from their drinking, and the couple then headed out and they were returning home. But before the couple decided to head home after they just had been to the pub, they then decided to go past a well-known local dealer in order to buy some drugs for the night. And while Ernest and his girlfriend were on their way to this well-known house, they were then intercepted by a man named Cameron Wilson. Cameron said that he knew exactly what they were doing and where they were heading to, and he knew that now that they had money on them. So he demanded all of their money. Ernest was not having it, and he said he's not giving any money to Cameron. He's a grown adult. Cameron's only 17 years old, so he thought that he could stand up to Cameron Wilson. However, Cameron thought that this no answer or this negative answer was not the right one, and he then proceeded to stab Ernest in the side of the neck. And then Cameron just ran away and left Ernest to bleed to death on the floor in the field. So things went a little quiet for a while, and then we fast forward to April of 2015, where a man named Cody Philander and his friend were busy walking across a field, and both Cody and his friend had backpacks on, and then they were randomly intercepted by Cameron Wilson once again. Cameron then saw Cody Philander and his friend had backpacks. He then demanded to see what exactly was in these backpacks. Cody and his friend were not having it, and they had a slight advantage on Cameron. Firstly, Cameron was alone. He was only 17 years old. Both Cody and his friend were in their 20s. They were bigger and they were smarter and they were stronger. And there were also 2 of them at the time. So they just told Cameron to beat it. They're not really interested in his shenanigans and he needs to get out of here before they thump him, basically. So Cameron then left, but he was not really impressed with how Cody and his friends spoke to him. And Cameron would not forget about this exchange. And then the next day, Cody was at a local shop in his suburb and Cameron happened to walk by Cody at the time. Cameron then noticed that Cody was all alone. He then walked straight up to him and then punched him in the face. Cody wore glasses at the time, so when Cameron punched him in his face, his glasses fell to the ground. Cameron then watched the glasses fall and he said to him, "Pick up the glasses." So while Cody was bent down to pick up the glasses, Cameron then proceeded to stab Cody in the back before then running away. And Cameron did this in broad daylight, so he now thinks that he's able to get away with anything. He's brave enough to do this with people to see, and clearly the police are not stopping him. Then, in the same month of April 2015, a young lady named Dawny Davids was busy walking across the field, where she then met up with a friend who was actually Cameron Wilson's cousin, and they then proceeded to walk down the field together. And while Dawny Davids and Cameron Wilson's cousin were busy walking across the field, just like out of nowhere, Cameron Wilson then proceeds to intercept them. He then starts talking to the two of them. Nothing really seems out of place because Dawny knows Cameron to be her friend's cousin. So they're all just having polite conversation. And with Cameron, we know that these things clearly don't last very long. And just like that, things turn and Cameron then proceeds to tell his cousin to start kicking Dawny, and if he doesn't, he's going to hurt him. So Cameron's cousin and Cameron start kicking Dawny. She then falls to the ground, and Cameron then proceeds to drag her deeper into the field. He then keeps dragging her because she's screaming. So Dawny's now being dragged deeper into this field. Cameron then turns to his cousin and says, "You need to get out of here now. I'm going to finish her off." And basically what Cameron did was he dragged her further away from the people in the suburbs close by this field because she was kicking and screaming. And then Cameron then took down her pants and he then proceeded to rape her. Once Cameron was finished and he was then pulling up his pants and I guess in a more vulnerable position, Dawny then proceeded to get up and start running for her life far away from this Cameron guy. But sadly Cameron was very quick and he then ended up catching up to Dawny and then stabbing her right in the back of the neck. Police were then called and they took a lot of evidence from Dawny. They also took her underwear and they then kept this as DNA. Police then went straight to Cameron Wilson's house. They then proceeded to question Cameron and ask exactly where he was at the time, what he was doing, and why he was then pointed out by a lot of witnesses as the person who attacked Dawny Davids. Cameron proceeded to plead his innocence and police still didn't take him into custody, and I'm not sure why. Maybe it's because they had a lack of evidence at the time. They had DNA, they had witness testimony, and people saw him. But sadly, he was still not taken into custody. And because of this, his reign of terror continued, and on the 24th of April 2015, two young girls named Abigail Plykes and Stacy-Lee Mahale, who were both 16 years old at the time, were on their way home from school in an area called Philippi. Both these girls were then approached by two boys who started then making polite conversation with the young girls. At first, everything seemed fine until it was not. One of the boys then proceeded to pull out a weapon and he then pointed it at Stacy-Lee. The boy with the gun then instructed Stacy-Lee and Abigail to follow him deeper into the area where they were alone now on a field. The boy with the gun then proceeded to Stacy-Lee. And not only did he just do this absolutely heinous crime, but then he proceeded to tell the other boy to stab both girls to ensure that they then die. And I'm sure you probably guessed by now, the boy with the gun was later identified as Cameron Wilson. But not only did Cameron tell this other younger boy to stab both Stacy-Lee and Abigail, but then while he was telling the boy to do this, he then proceeded to pull two tires and put them over each of the girls' necks and shoulders. And then horrifically, Cameron Wilson set the tires alight. Sadly, Stacy-Lee Mahale would not survive, but Abigail Plykes did survive, and just barely. And when Cameron Wilson turned around and noticed that Abigail was still clinging to life, he and his accomplice then proceeded to throw bricks and rocks at both of their heads. And while this was all happening, a man in the distance noticed that there was fire coming from a field, so he then quickly ran to investigate what was happening, because untamed flames can often turn into hectic disasters here in the Western Cape. So he then headed towards where the smoke was coming from, and while he was there, he described it like he was in a slow motion film, because when he got closer to the scene, he noticed two boys run, like he said, in slow motion past him. He did notice their faces, but when he then turned to where the smoke was coming from, he noticed that two young girls were lying back to back with tires over their shoulders, and they were both on fire. This man then proceeded to throw sand over them to hope that it would maybe stop the flames. It did, and he called the ambulance, he called the police, and Abigail was then taken to the hospital. She has absolutely devastating injuries, but Stacy-Lee sadly would not survive. But somehow Cameron Wilson was pointed out, and he was then dragged into the police station and questioned, then jailed for the murder of Stacy-Lee Mohale. But not soon after he had just been jailed did he then apply and successfully receive bail. And as soon as Cameron was out on bail, he squealed, and he said that police were hurting him and he was constantly being kicked and pulled and smacked around by the police officers while he was in custody. But then in September of 2016, while Cameron Wilson was out on bail, he clearly didn't learn his lesson, because while he was out on bail, on the other side of the area where he stayed, a young girl named Nicole McEwen, she was busy walking with a male friend, and they were walking across a field, and they were now going to head out to buy some drugs. The male friend of Nicole's, he then went inside while Nicole waited outside of the house. While Nicole was busy standing outside the house, she was then approached by Cameron Wilson, and he then asked her for a light. He wanted to light up his cigarette. Nicole didn't have anything on her, so she said, "Sorry, I don't have anything, maybe my friend inside will have something, but you have to wait till he comes out." And Cameron heard this negative answer, and she wasn't giving him exactly what he wanted. So he then proceeded to stab Nicole in the side of the neck. And when she kind of turned around to maybe look for her male friend, he then stabbed her in the back as well and then ran away. And I kid you not, Cameron's reign of terror just escalated on this night. And the same night, so he just attacked Nicole a couple of hours earlier, and then later on in the evening, a lady named Rosalind Lekita was in her home, and she kept hearing screaming. She kept hearing a lot of commotion, so she kind of peeped out of a window, and she sees two men, attacking some woman outside on the field. She then stops everything, she runs straight out of her house, and she heads towards these two men. When she gets there, they then proceed to throw bricks at her head. They start hitting her and beating her, and she's kind of left unconscious, but she's screaming and screaming, and a lot of people then hear, and they start coming out of their houses. These two men are then scared away, and they start running. Rosalind Lekita suffered incredible injuries to her head, and she was then taken to hospital, where she would then recover. But when everyone stopped and had a look around, they noticed exactly what Rosalind was trying to protect, and sadly they would then look down and discover the body of Lekita Moore. Earlier that day, Lekita Moore, who was 18 years old at the time, she was on her way home from a karaoke party when sadly she was attacked and found dead, naked, lying on a field near Nooit Gedacht, where Rosalind was then running to try and save her. When Lekita Moore was taken to the morgue, the doctors who were examining her found that she had been stabbed 98 times. Her breasts and crotch were also stabbed as well. And sadly, the savagery of this next part is absolutely disturbing. But not only was she stabbed 98 times, both of her legs had also been broken, and police believe that the reason why they were broken is because of the way that she was raped. And it is absolutely cruel, gruesome, inhumane, and just disgusting. But once Rosalind had come to, she then immediately identified Cameron Wilson as one of the men who attacked her. Cameron Wilson was then quickly arrested and taken to jail. But when Cameron was taken to jail, he would plead his complete innocence about attacking Lakita. But Cameron did end up speaking to police. But he was going to give up another man who Rosalind saw that night, not him, because he still claimed that he had nothing to do with it. But Cameron said that he knew who did. And he said that another boy punched her in the face after he and Lakita were headed home from their karaoke party. Apparently, this other man punched her in the face, where he then proceeded to stab and attack her. And the reason that Cameron said that he knew this was because he heard commotion again magically, and he came running to the scene, where he then said that he just stood there, watched the entire thing happen, and then just went home after he saw Lakita be horribly attacked on the field. But police didn't buy it. Rosalind pointed him out as one of the people who attacked her, and police took him straight to jail, where he was then denied bail, because not only was he on trial now for Lekita Moore's murder and horrific attack, but he now had at least 8 other counts against him, which included 5 counts of murder, 3 counts of attempted murder, amongst a whole lot of other crimes. Cameron was also held at the hospital section of the Goodwood prison because of the amount of death threats that he had received while behind bars. In the end, Cameron pleaded not guilty. However, not the judge, not anyone else outside believed a single word that he said. The judge who presided over the case then sentenced Cameron Wilson to 4 life sentences as well as another 71 years for his crimes. He received a life sentence for Toyah Stober, Stacey-Lee, Lekita Moore, and Dawny Davids. He also received 15 years for Alfonzo van Royen, 15 years for the attack on Ernest Erasmus, and a further 10 years for the attempted murder of Rosalind Lekita, just to name a few. However, Cameron Wilson was not given any sentence that didn't allow him to get parole. He will be eligible for parole roughly in 25 years when he is 40 years old. And when Cameron Wilson was sentenced, he clapped and said, quote, "At least I'm still alive," end quote. But that is the horrific case of Cameron Wilson, and let me know what you think of this case down below. It is absolutely heartbreaking and incredibly tragic. My condolences go out to all the victims and to all of those who were involved. But let me know what you think of this case down below. Police should 100% have been more involved in arresting Cameron earlier. But that's all from me. I hope you'll have a fantastic weekend further despite this very depressing case. Please stay safe out there and I'll see you again next week. Bye.